Hi, everyone. Spencer Pauly here with TJ Martinell, the Center Square's investigative reporter. Now, TJ, we're talking today about a recent article of yours on debates continuing within the Washington State Attorney General's Office of Domestic Extremism and Mass Violence Task Force. That's a mouthful, but basically what they're talking about is what constitutes domestic violence extremism and if it includes legally protected speech and activities. So let's just start off here with you maybe just briefly describing what is going on with the task force currently. Where are they discussing and where are they at right now?
I think that might be a good question to ask. It's a good question to ask based on the meeting, the most recent one, because the premise of this task force is to have people get together and talk about how do you prevent violence that comes from what they call domestic violent extremism and treat it from a public health perspective. And there's so many problems with this that's becoming really readily apparent because one, you're trying to treat protected speech and activities like it's a public health risk, which has so many First Amendment implications of going after certain people or groups. And then the other issues, they talk about mass shootings. Well, domestic violent extremism, who gets to it goes to what is that? And the Walla sheriff, as he pointed out during the most recent meeting, you cannot define it because it's going to involve legally protected First Amendment speech and activities, and people are going to sue. That's what's going to happen if the government starts treating certain people, certain ideologies, certain groups, certain thoughts, certain beliefs, certain religious convictions as a public health risk to be targeted for, treatment. You understand the problems with that. But what was so weird about the most recent meeting is they had a constitutional expert go through the history of the Second Amendment and talk about how the government, paramilitaries and militias, like private militias and private paramilitaries are illegal, always have been. They're not authorized. They're illegal in Washington State, I believe. So it's all like government stuff. But then they got onto this topic of ICE agents wearing masks for fear of doxing and being, having violence against them. And this was occurring the same day as ICE agents were having protesters say, kill them, shoot them to their faces, right? At these rallies and protest riots, whatever you want to call them. And the constitutional expert basically it was her personal opinion, but she said, if ICE agents have done nothing wrong, they have no reason to hide their face. And my question is, what does that have to do with domestic violent extremism? They're now talking about restrictions on law enforcement, and I don't understand what that has to do. It was such a weird meeting because it really didn't get to the issue of what domestic violent extremism is and how to treat it from a public health perspective. And it was so funny to listen to them discuss, because there were other topics, but they were talking about restrictions on, individuals owning firearms or having militaries, but then they go over to talking about restrictions on law enforcement. So it's like, guys, you kind of have to, it's like the stance changes based on the context. So it was I would encourage people to go watch the meeting and ask yourself, why are they discussing these issues?
It's, to start off, it's just interesting. It's unique to see the task force approach domestic violence extremism from a public health perspective. Now, were they all in agreement on that, or did some task force members say maybe we should approach this from a purely law enforcement perspective? Was that something that they even considered? Because we're talking about the Second Amendment.
Yeah, that's exactly what the Walla sheriff said. He just said, let's treat it from a criminal perspective. Did someone break the law? Okay, then they should be prosecuted, have charges filed against them. They should be punished. If someone is engaging in peaceful First Amendment, Second Amendment protected activity, you can't go after them as the government. And so he, cuts through a lot of this and just says, is it illegal or not legal? Or sorry, is it legal or illegal? That's the only thing that the government should be looking at. They shouldn't be looking at beliefs and ideologies. That's not the place of the government. And that's also not the place for law enforcement to say, And we're seeing this with the ballot initiative signature gatherers, where you have people calling 911 and saying, like, there was one guy who called 911 and said, these signature gatherers are taking a politically charged stance. It's like, guys, the First Amendment is not there so that we can talk about the weather or about the Packers versus the Patriots. Which team are you rooting for the Super Bowl? It's so that people can talk about very controversial ideas and not be afraid of having the government break into their home and drag them out and throw them in jail, or having people violently attack them in the street. That's the whole point of the First Amendment, is so that we can talk about controversial ideas, have them debated, and have them discussed. And so what was also interesting is, you think that they would be having reflections on how this whole definition of domestic violent extremism can lead to people thinking it is okay to commit acts of violence against people for engaging in First Amendment or Second Amendment protected activity, which we've seen in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, where people think it's perfectly acceptable to kill people for saying things that you don't like. And using the term, let's also be frank, let's not be also naive. Domestic violent extremism is a term intended to make people equate it with domestic violence. Like, oh, it's a wife beater. It's a guy who beats his wife. Like, we're going to equate them with the same thing as someone who holds beliefs that we don't want to accept. And this whole public health thing is, many people would argue, is a way of them trying to get around the First Amendment and saying, well, we can't throw you in jail, but we can treat you like you have a disease. It's a very passive aggressive, indirect way of going after people. It's almost like, are they going to have government agents show up at your door and say, we're not here to arrest you, but we have to, God forbid they get to the point where they start quarantining people, saying, you have political disease, and it's going to spread and it's going to infect everybody. So we've got to quarantine and we've got to impose all these restrictions on you. But it's not because of the First Amendment. It's because you have a disease, of ideological disease or something like that. I'm not saying they're going to do that. I treat it from a public health perspective. How is that scientific? Like, public health is supposed to be dealing with things like actual physical diseases or viruses or plagues or things that can cause physical health ailments. And I understand that people can argue that the psychological, mental impacts of stuff, but at the same time, we go back to the First Amendment. If somebody can claim that somebody else's ideology or speech is causing them physical harm, that same person can turn around and say, well, your beliefs are causing me harm. So where does that get us?
Yeah. And, that's what came to my mind when we're talking about a public health perspective. Is I suppose there is some kind of psychology to consider. But I think to make that the focus here is kind of eye-opening and questionable. But one other thing, TJ, is this whole conversation that happened, it veered into whether ICE agents should wear masks to protect identities, which you touched on earlier. Now, what prompted this tangent? And I mean, how does this connect back to the core focus of domestic violence extremism?
Right. I mean, well, they're trying. I feel like they're trying to thread this needle. They're trying to stick a square box in a round peg, where they're trying to say, on one hand, they're trying to discuss how individuals are restricted when it comes to owning firearms and exercising their rights, and how law enforcement should be how the government has all these privileges of, like, organizing National Guard and federal enforcement and police and all that kind of stuff. But then you go over to the other side of, like, oh, but that means that they have powers over citizens and have the ability to do things that they can't. Then it gets into this weird, like, I feel like there's this kind of, I don't want to use the term two-faced, but it's like on one hand, I don't know. It's a very interesting discussion, because I think what we're seeing is this dichotomy of agendas of, like, you see people, for example, what wasn't really emphasized during this discussion is, the constitutional scholar was talking about the Second Amendment, which is in the United States Constitution. But Washington State's Constitution has enshrined in its Bill of Rights a individual right to keep and bear arms. So, and yet we have all these restrictions in our state on gun ownership. Like certain guns are banned and you have to be a certain age and above the age of 18, and you have to, and they're putting all these restrictions on gun stores. If we had a right to say abortion enshrined in our Constitution, I don't think anybody would argue that they would just say you cannot pass any laws restricting abortion in any way, shape, or form of any kind. Shall not be infringed. That's the end of it. Instead, what we have is, even though it's not in the Constitution, we have our state funding and buying up abortion medication. So it's just interesting that the scholar didn't really mention that, because the Second Amendment is an application at the federal level, but we have our own protection of the right to keep and bear arms. And so I feel like it goes back to what the Walla Walla sheriff said, where he just kind of got to the heart of the issue. Is it legal or not legal? If it's a crime, and if somebody commits a crime and engages in violence, then we prosecute them. But going after people or targeting or focusing or emphasizing people who have views that we don't agree with, and it goes back to how you can't define domestic violent extremism, because I guarantee you somebody will sue the state over this, and it's going to go to the Supreme Court of the United States, and they're going to say, you can't do this. This is First Amendment protected speech, and the state cannot use public resources to undermine legally protected speech, people who are engaging in lawful activities, who are engaging in protests or rallies. That's the whole point, to petition the government for the redress of grievances. You can't say, well, they're extremists and we're going to treat them like a disease.
Yeah, and that's where it all gets murky here, right? What we're talking about. But the task force has some time to explore this more. I think the final report is due December of next year. So
yeah, they have to also come up with a charter, and they at some point they're going to have to define domestic violent extremism. And I think what will inevitably happen is they're either going to do one or two things. They're going to play it safe, and they're going to go with a definition that only includes illegal activity, or they're going to go with something that includes lawful activity, and you're going to have civil rights groups suing, saying, hey, if we fall under that definition, we're going to be targeted by the state and treated different. Yeah. I feel like it's going to lead to some very, very interesting conversations with this task force, where people are trying to avoid something that they cannot avoid. They want to include behavior, speech, ideologies that they don't like, but they know that there will be consequences if they do. And it's going to be legal, and it's going to also make it official. Like once you have a Supreme Court ruling on the issue, people can ignore it depending on the situation. But once the precedent's been set, it's really difficult for you to get around that, and people can cite that. It's now on the books. So the next couple of meetings, including the one coming up in January, is going to be very fascinating to watch, because they're going to have to come to terms with this within the next year and figure out what they're going to do. Right.
And that meeting coming up is on January 9th. And I know, TJ, you'll keep an eye on that and keep us posted. So appreciate you taking the time to talk about this, and looking forward to your continued coverage. This is Spencer Pauly. Until then, thanks for watching.